All right, it is time to get started. Welcome everybody to this hybrid, so digital and physical partly, also book launch of this wonderful book, The Radical Redemption Model by Professor Beatrice de Graaf. We're having this 1 hour book launch. And before we get started, let me briefly explain the setup, then I'll introduce the speakers and then we just get started. So the setup briefly is this, that I will have a short interview with Professor Beatrice de Graaf, then there will be a short reply by Professor Richard English, then an exchange between the two, and then there is a Q&A, basically an open floor, and you can ask any questions you like. My name is Rick Peels, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Religion and Theology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And I have the honor of being the series editor of the Extreme Belief and Behavior series, in which this volume is the first volume. So let me briefly introduce both speakers to you. If you want to know more, just look it up. We've got only 1 hour, so I'll be relatively brief today. So Professor Beatrice de Graaf is a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Humanities at Utrecht University, and she's a professor in international and political history, and also the director of the ADAPT project, which studies how societies can better adapt to crises. The second speaker of today is Professor Richard English. He's professor of politics at Queen's University Belfast, where he's also the director of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. Now, Beatrice, if I may start with you, maybe we can start our short exchange in 10 minutes by you answering my first question. Why is it that you carry out this research project, and why did you decide to write this book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, having me, and having not just hosting this show, but also the book in your series. Never received such a warm welcome for a book already before it came out, so thank you for that. Then to your question, to keep it brief, well, I have been working on terrorism for more than 25 years now. I was already interested in it as a student. And when I went to Bonn University in Germany in 1998, there was an announcement made by the Red Army faction, and I spoke to one of the members who explained to us students why the RAF decided to quit, which was quite an impressive event, talking to terrorists, listening to them, just renouncing their whole life's work, actually, because that was it was. So that had some impression. Then, after 2004, I started writing about terrorism, publishing myself, but I mostly focused on what you call the third-person perspective, the long-term historical perspective, the perspective of the state. Richard English has also contributed to this massively. Louise Richardson, Martha Crenshaw, I followed in their footsteps. And then COVID broke out. But already a bit before COVID, I decided that it should now be time that I should step up again and meet the terrorists themselves and ask them personally. I've been writing so much about them. So could I now, perhaps in the meantime, I had learned something about life histories, approach, semi-structured interviews. I started working with social scientists more. And that's why I decided I'm going to speak to them. And luckily enough, COVID broke out. It meant that all the archives closed, but the prisons remained open, strangely enough. So during COVID time, I was able to visit prisons in the Netherlands, interview practically all jihadist detainees here, and also went just before that to Indonesia. And then unfortunately, Kenya and Nigeria was more difficult during COVID. So there the interviews were online. So that's how it started.
Yeah, fantastic. And so if you were to compress this entire research into a couple of sentences and say, what is the core insight that you take it your book adds to the existing literature, what would it be?
Well, again, I have to start with my great examples in the field, and Martha Crenshaw and Louise Richardson, most notably, because they already mentioned in passing how important narratives of redemption were. Just in passing in their major books, What Terrorists Want and Terrorism in Context. And then I listened to the terrorists and recorded what they were saying. And my first insight was, it really does matter. And then I was a bit uncertain because I thought I may be biased. I've been brought up a Christian, so do I listen too much to narratives of redemption and sin, and do I put it too much in a religious light? But then it turns out, by all kinds of cross checks and calibrations, and it really was true. And then the second insight was these redemption narratives are not just formulas, they're not just words, they follow a certain pattern. They are narratives in the way social psychologists use it to make sense of how people behave. It's a coping mechanism. So it's a behavior, it's an attitude, and it's a belief all in one. And it gives them direction. And the third insight is that we'll talk about the second thing, the narratives, how they follow a certain pattern in a minute more. But the third insight is, I think, a very practical one, because as an historian, I'm also quite practical sometimes. You just want to help out with your histories. There is very little recidivism in terrorism. Over the whole, in all countries that's been researched, almost only 5 to 6% of terrorists fall back. Well, that's quite a generalizing statement, but it's been investigated in many places, and it holds true in almost all of the cases. So, and you could say, yeah, well, they just blow themselves up, or they get captured, or they. But the model that I derived out of this redemption narrative approach gives an insight, an explanation on why there is so little recidivism. Because in the end, redemption needs to end in its final stage with validation. It needs to be invalidated by a community, by a sign, by a divine entity interfering in your life, by a feeling, by something that happens. And if that doesn't happen, it's not validated, it's infringed, it's even contaminated. And this is what Douglas McAdams has written in the social psychological world on how redemption narratives play out in people's lives. So it's his theory that I apply to terrorists, and it turns out that it gives you also an inkling and even a sense of direction for policy practices in why there's so little recidivism. And we should just be able to nudge and to help this cycle towards contamination. So that's in brief, I think, 3 of the main insights.
Right, fantastic. Yeah, that's a lot. May I ask you, so what are the maybe 1 or 2 major obstacles that you run into? And you already mentioned the COVID-19 crisis, which also turned out to be a benefit to your research, but also maybe more content-wise or methodology-wise. What did you bump into?
Well, I bumped into the question, how do you operationalize religion? If you take people's beliefs seriously, and you yourself, first of all, contribute to that with the first person approach, that it's very important to start and sit down and listen to what people express and say about their beliefs, and then you can map that up and follow that up, but what they do. So it's not just the orthodoxy of radical beliefs or fundamentalist beliefs, it's also the praxis. So you can also trace and map that. So you said so, but then how do you then map that on a more third person perspective of a contextual theory? And I'm very happy that he's here today as well. I think he's still here, Kees van den Bos. Yeah, he wrote a book, Why People Radicalize, and he listed all the theories, and in one of those theories stood out, and he uses that quite extensively himself as well. It's the quest for significance. People need to find direction, and they use beliefs, they use behaviors, and they use practices to embed those beliefs. It's emotion, but it's also attitude. And with Kees, and luckily Kees and I live nearby, so also during COVID, we could talk a lot about it and walk around, and with his help, and she's also here, also have to mention her, Annelotte Jansen, who was my student assistant, and PhD. Was also able to discuss it with her. That's not something just for jihadists, but also for right-wing extremists. And that's how I then, Douglas McAdams, was able to operationalize extreme beliefs in history, so combine historical research, interviews, oral history, the psychological notions of radicalization processes, and then combine that with those religious beliefs again in the redemption cycle. I don't know, Rick, should I perhaps briefly show a graph to portray how such a model looks like? Because it may sound quite obfuscated and confused now, but in reality, it's a very straight, neat line.
Yeah, if you can make it pop up, that would be great.
I'll pop it up very briefly, and I'm only going to show 2 slides. Yes. Can you see it already?
Yeah, it shows up. Good. Yep.
Yes, so this is the arc or the line of radicalization. It's based on Kees van der Bos's book, Why People Radicalize. But my addition is this arrow, religion as moderator. So religion is not so much a predictor. We can talk about why it's very hard to say so, but it shapes the narratives that people develop while they're on their way towards extremism or radicalization. So it gives sense and direction. So it lifts them up, it puts them in this higher level of a metaphysical battle between good and evil. They're going to earn points in heaven, they're being validated by the community, and that's how radicalization works. And my model, the last slide that I would like to point out to you is then this one. There is this reported and perceived moral deficit. They all talked about it. I'm just sitting on my couch. I'm being a couch potato. I'm doing nothing for Muslims. I need to step up. A sense of calling. There was a scripture text read out to me from the Quran. I heard a preacher. There was a little green bird, which is a very hello symbol in Islamic tradition. I felt in my dreams and I felt that I was called to arms and then a surrender to struggle. But very important is last stage. It needs to be validated. So you could see it as a cycle, and the cycle could be broken, it could continue. People take action, they take action again, they again feel a sense of deficit, and then they flip out of it, or it totally ends. I think that's enough for now to explain it here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. That was helpful and clarifying. I had another question about the value of history and the way it can be combined with fieldwork. But for time's sake, I think we can move on. And I also have no doubt that the issue of history will return in the comment that we will soon hear, because Professor English has kindly agreed to respond to the book. And as an historian, I have no doubt that that issue will return. It's terrific to have you. Thank you for agreeing to do that. And the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rick, and many congratulations, Beatrice. I would urge everyone in this meeting not only to read it, but to buy it. I think it's a very important contribution, and it's part of a vital series that Rick's editing. So congratulations to you both, and particularly today to Beatrice. My only regret is that I'm not actually physically in the Netherlands to be able to meet with people and discuss that. But as a famous IRA man said years ago, there will be another day. There will be another day, and I'll see you in person. But it's great to be here. I'm going to make 3 observations about the book. The first is geographical, the second is argumentative, and the third is methodological. And I hope that each of these points that I elaborate on briefly will reflect my sense of the originality and significance of Beatrice's book. The first thing is geographical. And I've written about aspects of this before, but the geography of knowledge production is a really crucial thing in all fields. And in the field of the study of terrorism, that's as true as it is, as pointedly true as it is in most other areas. Geographical centers of gravity make a huge difference. And I think after the 9/11 atrocity, the enormous explosion of work in and led by the United States of America had all sorts of consequences, some of it very benign in terms of far more research funding. Some brilliant scholars became involved in some major work, but there were some aspects to that which probably tilted the balance of understanding of terrorism in a particular direction. For example, an over-focus on the kind of terrorism that most people in the United States were fascinated by, understandably predominated. And because certain disciplines, political science, psychology, economics to a degree, tended to dominate within the American academic response to terrorism after 9/11. There were aspects of that which had a center of gravity. There is a very important Dutch school for the study of terrorism, which has long roots in Dutch experience, which has scholarly excellence exemplified by some of the people I can see on the screen in front of me. And if you look at this series and Beatrice's important book within it, a number of the aspects of that particularity of approach are very striking. There's an emphasis on normality, normalcy, as Rick refers to it, the normality of the people who are being studied. There's an emphasis on detailed cross-case comparison, which is something that Beatrice emphasizes in her own work. There's an emphasis on interdisciplinarity, and there's a strong stress on something which Beatrice has already mentioned today and which comes through vibrantly in the book, which is the importance of listening to what actors actually say and actually believe. One of the ironic things about much of the research that emerged in the more than 20 years since 9/11 on terrorism is how many books and articles about terrorists have comparatively little reflection of serious listening to what the people themselves actually believed, and what they actually said, and what they did. Now, it's not that this is something which is only done in the Netherlands, but it is the case that whether it's in Utrecht or in Amsterdam or in The Hague or in Leiden, there is a particularity of approach here. I think both Beatrice's book and Rick's series exemplify this nobly, which is very important to cherish. And maybe in 2025, with the United States being in a different crisis at the moment, with United States universities being in a particular crisis at the moment in terms of what people feel it's possible to study, where serious advisors in terms of their influence Trump administration have included people like Sebastian Gorka. It seems to me that it's very important that a serious-minded emphasis on detailed cross-case comparison based on interdisciplinarity, based on context, based on normalcy, and based on listening to what terrorists actually say, and let's be honest, what they often very sincerely and profoundly believe is a crucial thing. And so one aspect of Beatrice's book, which I'd want to stress, is that it does reflect and exemplify and embody the best of an important intellectual tradition in the Netherlands, from the Netherlands, which I think should be amplified as much as possible. So that's the first point. Second point is argumentative. Beatrice's book makes a decisive contribution to the literature. She talks about radical redemption as embodying the fourth R. Louise Richardson, whom Beatrice has mentioned, who is a wonderful terrorism scholar, her book from 2006, What Terrorists Want, argues that revenge, renown, and reaction are three of the key things which terrorists are pursuing through their careers, through their actions, through their campaigns, through their violence. And to that, Beatrice adds the fourth R of, well, a double R of radical redemption, but of redemption. And I think this really is a major contribution to the literature. It's interesting also to reflect on the fact, not true in all disciplines, not true in all subjects, that some of the major figures to whom you are adding, Beatrice has made this explicit herself, of female scholars. I mean, Martha Crenshaw, arguably the greatest of terrorism scholars, I think, has been studying this since the 1960s. Louise more recently, but again, very important. Beatrice herself. Audrey Cronin's work, again, there's a serious body of female scholarship, which I think is very, very important. That's a footnote, but not a trivial one. And I think Beatrice's book adds to the literature very valuably. It picks up on work by people like McAdams, where there is strong foundation in the literature to build on. Beatrice pays homage to that appropriately. But the redemption aspect of this is really crucial. And there's a quotation Beatrice uses in the book where she talks about her interview, and she says, quote, "All speak of experiencing a sense of deficiency, of falling short in some way. All speak of experiencing a sense of deficiency, of falling short in some way." So I think the fourth R is a very valuable one. And I think, as with all powerful books, I hope that this will be the beginning of a series of explorations where people will look at what this means in terms of other contexts, in terms of other interviewees, in terms of other terrorists. And the genius of Beatrice's book is she traces the complexity of the journey from feeling that sense of deficiency to seeing the violence that people engaged in or tried to engage in as being redemptive. And that's why the story is so good. And there's an interesting aspect of this, that strategically, the violence they practice in terms of political strategic goals is almost certain to be unsuccessful. But at the redemptive apotheosis for an individual, there's part of the journey which is explained there. I think that's really crucial. So the first thing I'd stress is the Netherlands school. And I would be, I'm speaking as someone who's born in Belfast, grew up in England, lives in Belfast. So I'm outside the Netherlands school, except as a privileged guest occasionally. But I think it's something really to be emphasized in the next 25 years of scholarship. Secondly, there's a decisive contribution to the literature, an argumentative dynamic, which will be very rich in laying the foundations for further work. And the third thing is methodological. I mean, Rick has mentioned the historical aspect. I am going to talk about this. I'm trained as an historian, and I think that there has recently been a shift towards historians becoming somewhat more prominent than had been the case within a literature from which they'd largely been comparatively absent. Far less work by historians over the period of Martha Crenshaw's career, for example, than by political scientists, by economists, by psychologists, by criminologists, by international relations scholars. That's now beginning to change. And I think Beatrice's work is a really heavy contribution to that, and I welcome it. And part of this is about the aspect of what it is historians bring. Historians will tend to bring an emphasis on what I refer to as the complex particularity and ultimately the uniqueness of each context. Context is a crucial bit of this book by Beatrice de Graaf. It's a really important aspect of what she's explaining, and it's absolutely crucial. Historians will tend to emphasize the importance of first-hand evidence, of primary sources, as I was brought up to call them. And again, actually going to and listening to and engaging serious-mindedly and respectfully with these people is something which has drawn first-hand material into the work, and that complements and helps to understand the complexity of context. And also historians tend still to have a skepticism about overly rigid pro-Christian abstract theories. It's not that Beatrice is denouncing theory, we've heard that already, but she's not comfortable with one answer, with one key which unlocks the door to explanation. She wants there to be a sense of studying how you look at the complexity of the radicalization journey, as she calls it, towards terrorism. And here I think it's really important that she has a multi-level approach. There's the individual, but there's the meso and macro levels of concentric circle of expansion, and that's what makes this so powerful. So there's a historical methodology here, which I think does bring something, not which undermines what psychologists do, not which undermines what political scientists do. It complements it, but it offers something very particular and I think very helpful in emphasizing the complex particularity of context, the importance of original and sources listened to in respectful and empathetic detail, and the emphasis on being skeptical about easy answers. Where I say to my PhD students frequently, if someone offers you a seductively easy explanation for a complex phenomenon, they're probably offering you something you should be skeptical about. And I think historians' instinct is towards that. So this book is a book which I think reflects and strengthens even further a particular geographical tradition within the understanding of terrorism, within the hermeneutics of terrorism. It contributes decisively to the literature in terms of adding an R to Louise Richardson's set of trilogy of R's, if you like. The third R has been added to by a fourth one here. And methodologically, it's got a particular historian's emphasis, which I think helps us to understand it. Some of the themes we might pick up on in the rest of the conversation, but that's up to Beatrice and to Rick and to others. But it seems to me that the role of history within understanding terrorism is a significant one. Why is it that historians have not been more prominent until comparatively recently? Beatrice mentioned another aspect of it in terms of religion, which is obviously crucial here. It's interesting to reflect on something which we tend not to discuss, which is the positionality religiously of the people who are doing the research. I mean, it's that even if people are believers, they tend to be effectively agnostic as they present as scholars. It's quite rare in university settings for someone in a seminar to own up to being someone who reads the New Testament, the Christian New Testament, and believes in it. Okay, and yet it seems to me that the positionality with regard to religion is going to have a particular dynamic, and Beatrice does mention this in her book in terms of Christian background and so forth. But the religious aspect of this is I think, seriously important. And another thing is also the importance of the geographical context we might discuss, because it does seem to me that amongst the various European countercultures of understanding terrorism, it seems to me that as in politics now, Europe is beginning to discover a kind of countercultural voice in foreign policy. There is in the study of terrorism an important dynamic which is offered here. So it's geographically significant, it's argumentatively significant, it's methodologically significant. Buy a copy, read it, recommend it to your students if you work in universities as a teacher. I welcome this book, I celebrate it, I applaud Beatrice for it, and I look forward to the ensuing conversation. And thank you for listening to those brief 3 points.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. That was fantastic, and thank you for these kind words, both on the volume and the series. And I'm glad to see that some of the main approaches, or all of them, really resonate with you. There's also some deeper questions in your commentary that I think deserve a follow-up. So, Beatrice, is there anything you would like to follow up on in particular? There's of course the question: how come history has been relatively absent for such a long time? The particularity of this, the Netherlands school. Anyway, so lots of things to follow up on. The picking is yours.
Yeah, I would like to say two things briefly on the history and the religion aspect. But first of all, Richard, thank you so much. You're such a hero in publishing on terrorism already so long, and now you just saying this, and everyone should know that you're not earning any form of commission by doing so. You just do this spontaneously. So thank you so much. And let me then really also flag two books that Richard wrote that also do this. It's on the IRA, the Armed Struggle, History of the IRA, and the other book, Irish Freedom, The History of Nationalism in Ireland, because those two books also show a combination of this third-person approach of following history for a long time, centuries back from history to the present day. And third person just means that you write from a detached perspective, not from an empathizing inside perspective. But then you also lighten it up with first person anecdotes, citations, quotes, and interviews with IRA persons. So I think that's the way that how historians should go about it as well. So combining, if possible, deep historical records with oral history, if at least the persons are still alive, or find oral history reminiscences in the archives itself. So why is history so important? History is difficult because, as you rightly say, Sir Richard, it looks for the unique, it looks for the individual feature, and it does not come up with causal explanations or dynamic causality and correlations and big models. And I actually didn't really like at first the word model in the title of this book, Radical Redemption Model. In the end, we caved in to OUP, also because it's a nice catchphrase and it does make some sense because based on unique features, this model is still open enough to allow for historical changes. But then you have the social psychologists who have far more stringent explanatory power. Kees van der Bos explained to me how he works with variables and baseline tests, and we just don't do that as historians. So historians are notoriously difficult in coming up with a more analytical or a more cooked out higher level abstract modeling of terrorism. Yet terrorism itself is inherently historical in the sense that it reinvents its own history. Terrorism is a phenomenon structured by a narrative of a bad past, of a breach in the present, and then an eschatological rupture to the future. So it mobilizes, it radicalizes parts of society. It doesn't just want to change reality, it wants to transcend reality. And from a zero, people want to become a hero. They want to become angels, even revenging angels in a higher battle. So the last battle, the Beak, it's the magazine of IS, and the Beak is the name where allegedly the last battle should take part. And as many interviewees told me, if you would have the choice between sitting on your couch and going to Syria and Iraq and really participate there in the locality, the Beak, where the end of times will be hallowed in, you should be there. It's also almost a fear of missing out. So I think in the terrorism itself, there is already this reinventing, this rewriting of history, a very historical idea without the facts obviously being correct in all the way. But it's a temporal way of thinking. It's as a eschatological way of thinking. And the second, very briefly, Richard also alludes to this, how to operationalize religion. I used the model of Dan McAdams, and Kees, as I mentioned, helped me to this. But I should also mention Lauren Dawson. He's also co-editing a book with Rick, because Dawson says you should not just stare yourself blind on the hard aspects of religion and in saying, for they didn't even attend a mosque or they didn't go to church. Religiosity, that's what Dawson uses, is the salience of religion in someone's life, including things as practice, devotion, belief, knowledge, communality, and experience. So religion is heavy, thick, and religiosity is more informal. It also follows the orthopraxis, the practices. And that's how I looked upon this as well. And that is something that you can also pinpoint and identify in historical trajectories. So I think that's also a way to combine Lawson's concept of religiosity from religious studies, to combine that with an historical empirical approach.
All right. Well, that was a wonderful exchange. We've got about half an hour left for any questions. You can address them primarily to Beatrice de Graaf, but also to Richard English if you like. There are two options. You can just unmute yourself raise your hand. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. If you do not feel comfortable with that, you can also paste it in the chat. That's another option. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Javier, please start. Yes.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Richard. That was very interesting. I have not read the book, so I am making this question without having read the book. But I wanted to ask you in these models, when you talk about religiosity, and then like Richard mentioned about deficiency, that some of the people experience themselves. Do you think that some of that is related to, for example, that because it seems to me that some of it is what they're doing in some respects in that redemption model is a festival of atonement. They're trying to get like this redemption is, this what some religious talks about, like rituals. This is rituality of atonement. They want to atone for their wrongdoings. But for example, Taylor, because these are Dutch people, they talked about like now there is no place to have those things. Do you see a connection? Is there a connection between this idea of like, okay, we live in the immanent frame, there's nothing to express how to get rid of our faults, and so I'm gonna like engage in something like that, an extremism? I hope that makes sense, my question. Yeah.
Just could you explicate a little bit what you refer to with Taylor? So he says in this modern day and age, there's no room for doing penance, and that's what terrorists are looking for. Is that what you say?
No. So for example, like I'm saying, if there's no, Taylor says like there that in the secular age, there's no space to have these rituals, in the immanent frame. It's just like everything is kind of like well, he uses contested and contestable, but there's like this idea that there's no space for rituals, for imaginations, for sacramentality. Now my question is like, do you see any kind of like
Yeah.
pairing between that kind of aspect that people cannot express that, and then how some people are finding redemption by using this going to extremes places to find forgiveness?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it also allows me to give a brief historical example. In my book, and Richard alluded to that, I also start with the deeper historical past. So for historians, modern day terrorism is very much connected with the emergence of the nation state. So it's directed against the government, against a national audience, a public. So in that sense, it's different from things that happened in the 18th or the 16th or the 14th century. So one of the first waves of modern terrorism, David Rappaport wrote about it, is anarchism. And in my book, I have some cases of anarchist terrorists who also appropriate the notion and even the religious language and the symbols of redemption. For example, I refer to Auguste Vaillant. He's quite infamous or famous. He threw a bomb in the French Chamber of Deputies in 1893, and he said, "I am the bearer of the popular claims. I stand up on behalf of them. I am the redeemer of the people." So he presented himself like a kind of a messiah, letting himself be crucified. And then he says, "Hail to him who labors by no matter what means for the transformation of society." So for him, it was a completely secularized way of practicing religious beliefs, extreme beliefs, and he portrayed it on the awakening of the people, on the suffering of the people, and standing up to the repression of the evil government, and then transforming that situation in France. That was in the last decade of the 19th century. So it's very much religious language, and also something that will also play to Richard's work. Bobby Sands, he's a very, again, infamous IRA prisoner, activist, a leader, and he became world known for self-starving himself. So he suffered from self-starvation in prison through what people call sacralization of hunger. And he said, "I'm dying not just to attempt to end the barbarity of the age clock," so the treatment that the British gave to Irish prisoners, "or to gain recognition of a political prisoner." That's Louis' reaction. "But primarily, I stand up for the Irish nation, because what is lost in here is a loss for the Republic as a whole, and those wretched oppress it. And then he cites John, chapter 15, verse 13, greater love than this hath no man, than he lay down his life for his friend. And if you go to Belfast, I haven't seen it myself, but Richard will know more about it. There's murals where Bobby Sands is portrayed as a dying Christ with the Hail Mary symbol around him. Allegedly, he died with a rosary in his hand, and above, on one of the murals, it says, "Blessed are those who hunger for justice." So I cannot agree with you in saying that it's only religion or jihadism in the modern day and age that gives a kind of what's it called, ventil, and valve, safety valve for extreme hatred and no notions of atonement and penance. It's also there in secularized ideologies, and it's still there. I think it cannot be wiped away.
Right, thank you so much. There's another question by Vali Jamal. Floor is yours.
Hello. My question is for Beatrice regarding radicalization in the modern day. You mentioned the example of a young person. Real quick, sorry, can you hear the background noise
Yes.
from my end?
Oh, I hear you correctly. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, just want to make sure. You mentioned the example of someone's, I'm sitting on my couch, what am I doing with my life? The sort of existential this desire to sort of make something of yourself, this desire to sort of redeem yourself. A big factor in the, I think, recent radicalization that's been talked about is the presence of the internet and online radicalization, both through right-wing radicalization and if you go back maybe a decade, a lot of ISIS recruits were found through the internet. I wanted to ask, how does this sort of new medium, this new technology, and this pathway kind of influence the narrative of these terrorists, of these radicalized people? This idea of like redemption, this idea of like being part of this special group, this special community, being chosen, so to say, and what how do we combat it?
Yes.
If
Can you see my screen? Yeah. So let me very briefly respond to that, because that's an excellent question. In a sense, terrorists have also always been early adopters of new technology. So the anarchists used handheld dynamite and newspapers, and then the nationalist terrorists used radio, and the revolutionary terrorists used the TV. And so terrorists have always been a little Gideon-like group that needs to project more power than they actually have, and new technologies help them with that. So in that sense, it's not that new. However, there is a mechanism that plays out very well on the socials, and it's called gamification of terrorism. And it plays into this model that I showed you, that terrorists need to feel validated. And the validation comes from the community, in lieu of being validated by God directly himself. Although they report about miracles as a validation quite a lot as well, the jihadists. But the gamification of terrorism doesn't mean that they game a lot. It means that they use game design elements that come with the digital age within non-game context, such as points, as leaderboards, or badges. And if you look up, for example, the notion of Hazanat, it's a terminology from Sunni Islam, and it just means that you have to do good deeds. But then in the internet, Rick once called it capture value. So you capture a value that's actually too complex to capture in binaries. They still do it, and they exchange on X or on other socials. Say, if you do this and that, you earn more points. So during Ramadan, if you do your shopping for your grandmother, you earn more points. But this can also be drawn into a more evil, more dark light in saying, if you murder someone, if you leash out against the infidels during Ramadan, you earn more points. So it's harmless socialization, but it can also be a moderator. Here you have it again, a moderator to radicalization. People kind of brag amongst each other who earn more points. And I also want to briefly make the bridge to right-wing terrorists because there they do it as well. So they brag on 4chan and 8chan leatherboards amongst themselves, and they say they only killed that many people. So Brandon Tarrant or Breivik were far more effective. They had a higher score. This idiot Peyton G, the Buffalo shooter, he only had 10 people dead, which is actually, it's horrible even saying so, but that's how they sort of measure, account for each other's behavior. So the thing that propels and accelerates radicalization processes via the internet, it's not so much the new technologies as such, but things like this, the gamification that can be easily facilitated through the internet. And you also see this, and I also would like to take one more liberty in pointing to Annelotte Janssens' work, because she's applied the redemption theory to incels. And the incel culture is also very much a male, misogynist, online internet culture, where also she wrote an article about it, and it's called, brilliant title, and I'm very happy that I can express these words now in a scholarly setting. Who's the alpha male now, bitches? That's her title. It's not my expression. It's an article on Elliot Rodger and radical redemption in the Journal for Sociology. So you can easily find it online, and the online world does accelerate and does facilitate this redemptive notion more as a moderator, but it does not cause it in principle, I would say. I hope that already gives some answers to you, Vali.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful.
So Annelotte adds that it was Rogers' expression, not her own words. I've also added a link to the article
Of course.
in the chat. Yeah, just to be clear. There's one more question by Kees van der Bos. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. I read the book and it was a pleasure. It's really interesting, very insightful, detailed interviews that convey a lot of new findings and theories and ideas. And while being a narrowly minded social psychologist, I of course like the model kind of aspect, and that's what my question is focusing on. A model is nice because it can suggest things that you would like to examine in future research or future interventions and things like that. What are the one or two top things that you would like to examine? Perhaps put forward in a new book or whatever.
Thank you so much, Kees. And again, let me stress to the others that Kees did not just read it. I have to admit to this, Kees, you also really helped me think on how to combine a historical, very descriptive approach with this very rigid, in a good sense, a meticulous social scientist approach. Yeah. So we always have this to and fro. That's why we work together. We keep each other sharp. And the model, indeed, it does help to open up the space for more research. I think the thing that I just pointed to, what Annelotte's been working on, incel terrorism, the recent case of the Erasmus hospital shooter, it's a very interesting one, because oftentimes things that are too idiosyncratic or too strange are discarded and cast away as just mentally deranged. But if you accept for a start as the normalcy hypothesis and not immediately pathologizing them, but taking them as normal, if you read across the mentions that this Fuad L, this Erasmus shooter, made, he was also trying to find points, find validation. And he's also talked about the deliverance of the male race from womanhood, and he wanted to become a doctor in order to develop an artificial incubator in order to wipe out the necessity for women to exist. So it's not just retribution or revenge, male misogyny. It's also, he really believed in a world that would be better without women in it. And so if you would apply this model to a case like that, other things would spring out than they do now. So I think right-wing extremism, Christian white nationalism, also is very much, I would almost say, practically prepared for having the radical redemption model applied to them. You may remember this Atlanta spa shooter person, who really reported about being sinful. He was a sexual addict, and he went into those spas because there were women present of Asian background whom he attributed with being the main seducers of the male humankind. So they had to be eradicated, and he would then atone for his. It's horrible to relate to all of this, but it makes sense. And then it's too often, again, the Atlanta spa shooter as well, it's too often discarded as mentally deranged, not properly in his head. Whereas with the jihadists, they are always immediately written into this jihadist trend. And with the incel and the right-wing extremism, it's more rarely the case. And I think the model would also provide good background or starting point to do that. So thank you for helping me making that bridge.
Thank you.
Perfect. I don't see any other raised hands at this stage. There's Theo. One thing I wanted to ask myself, and then let's get to Theo van Willenburg, is Richard, was there any element or various elements of the radical redemption model that you recognized in the subjects that you interviewed over the years, where you thought this also applies to this rather different group?
Yeah, I mean, Beatrice is very sensitive to the fact that each context is unique, and in that sense, while you're comparing things, you're recognizing you're comparing particularities, and I think we would agree entirely on that. I mean, within the nationalist terrorisms that have predominated in this city, in Belfast, there has been often a religious component to it. And I think there, at the individual level, there often has been a redemptive quality to it. I mean, Beatrice mentioned the 1981 hunger strike, and particularly Mr. Sands' death on hunger strike as an IRA volunteer. And much of the iconography around that was religious, but also, you know, there was an intensification during the hunger strike, and Sands' diary refers to how the men were saying the rosary twice every day. And although many of the people who survived that period are now agnostic or atheistic, at the time there was an intensification of religious experience. I think the point I would take out there is there often is a sense of morality to terrorist behavior. It's hard, often understandably, to see that, but there is a kind of altruistic quality to what people are often intending to do. And within that, there is a redemptive quality. And for some of the people who were on hunger strike, there was a sense of assuming that their death would be doing good. And therefore, there was a kind of martyrdom dimension to that. So while it's very different from Beatrice's interviewees, there is a strong religious component. It's also, as I was hearing Beatrice speak powerfully about her book there, you know, obviously, religion is also important in countering terrorism. I think in many of the teachings that there are in the main religions, the center of gravity of that often is critical of the violence that terrorists practice in the name of religious causes. And so I think, you know, while it doesn't tend to gain as much attention on the news, you know, most Muslim authorities are condemnatory of the violence that people practiced in violent jihadism, just as during the Irish conflicts, most Christian leaders tended to be condemnatory of the murderous violence on all sides. So that's another dynamic to it. I think there's a sort of there's a religious component in that intimacy of relationship between terrorism and counterterrorism. I think there's another question in the chat there, maybe.
Yeah, let's do. I think there's time for 2 more questions or so. So maybe Theo van Willenburg first, and then the question from the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. You're still looking very young. It's incredible how hard you work, and still being such a bright young professor. I read your book in the Dutch version, of course, and in seeing the situation of radicalization in American politics these days, I wonder what you would say about this model that you propose, so model, whether it would also be applicable to what I would call evangelical or Protestant extremism. Because the whole idea of redemption by earning points, I think it's great for Islam, of course. But of course, Protestants, at least, believe that Christ has earned all our points already. So my question is, the redemption is not via our own work, so to say. My question is, what would you say about evangelical or Protestant radicals? I know about the growth of Christian white supremacy groups in the US, Christian Identity, for instance, which is a kind of strange church. Can you say something about how this model would apply to evangelical radicalism in the United States?
Yes, thank you for your question. I'm almost half a century old, Theo, so I already have some history on my bucket. About your question, the evangelicals, that's fascinating stuff, and I'm looking at it quite closely now. I already mentioned right-wing extremism, which overlaps, but not totally, with white Christian nationalism, because sometimes right-wing extremism is very secularized, it's very pagan. But there's a huge overlap, and I'm just bringing this up. Graham Macklin brought it to my attention that in the right-wing extremist scene and also in the white Christian nationalist scene, which is not necessarily extremist and violent already, but as I said, ideologically it does overlap with right-wing extremism. So the difference is being willing to subvert and upend democracy and use violent means for that. What they do is they worship their own saints. So they completely reappropriate Christian symbols and use them to create a kind of a sect-like cult. So they prop up Tarrant, they prop up Breivik, they make murals out of them. They do that with Donald Trump as well. They see him as a prophet, as a Messiah-like figure, as a King Cyrus I, the one who let the promised people go back in exile, go back to their homeland. So there are all these references to biblical notions, and that's not doctrinal, it's practical. So that's the orthopraxy. So it's like lighting a little candle out of a sentiment, and it doesn't quite subscribe in a fundamentalist creed, but it just gives you some sense of belonging. So people will look at this image and they will recognize a hero, they will recognize a warrior, they will recognize a saint with a halo around his head. They will recognize writing on his weapon. So they will recognize this eschatological promise that he will rid the world of colored people. It's the great replacement theory that he has in his hands. It's his Bible, his manifesto. So it's scripture, but it's also practice, and it's belonging. You subscribe to this. You sort of secretly want to belong to this. And that's something that we should list very carefully, because these practices can turn more nasty and more violent. We saw that with the January 6th riots in 2021 at the Capitol, the Proud Boys, who also waved around with Bibles and crosses. But Tobias Kramer, he's written an excellent study on the rise of white Christian nationalism. He calls it A Godless Crusade, brilliant title. And he says it's the use of hallowed symbols, but they're hallowed out. So they can be used by Christian believers and non-Christian radicals alike. So you have to be very careful in what we actually are seeing here and how exactly this motivates people to jump into action. Because most people that subscribe to Salafist ideals or to Christian nationalism, they do not feel chosen to commit the violence. So that still is the radicalization puzzle that is to be solved. Not everyone that has these horrible images on their wall or in their computer, they're the terrorists. So we also have to make that distinction. But it needs to be made, and we need to do more in the research on this. Sorry, I'm closing it now.
Yeah. Let's see. So Scott Gustafson adds to it that the New Apostolic movement comes to mind in the US as a sort of redemptive apocalyptic narrative. So the idea of that Christians ought to conquer the 7 mountains of culture to usher in the return of Christ. So by way of comparison, there's one more question here that I would like to put in front of you, Beatrice. This is Erline, wondering to what extent, if at all, this model can be combined with a 3N model for trying to explain radicalization. So that's needs narrative.
It needs narrative and network by Kruglanski. Yeah. I think it overlaps because, as I said, with the help of Kees van der Bos, I operationalized further the quest for significance model by Kruglanski, and he has developed that further and saying it's not just a need, it's also a network, a community of people, and it's an encompassing network. And he published that in 2022, and then I had already submitted my manuscript. I would almost say that my manuscript very much makes the same case, that it's the belief, the belonging, and the behavior that comes together in the way the radical redemption motive plays out. Hence the orthopraxy. So it's not just orthodoxy, it's also orthopraxy. It's a belief, a cognitive thing, but it's also an attitude, it's a sense of belonging, it's behavior. And it's validated by a network, a community, or invalidated by that network.
Right.
So I think it maps onto that quite smoothest. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe in that order. So belong, behave, believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So it's almost time. One final question then by Dion Forster, who says, I've been wanting to ask you about the category of religion, the broader category of the theological in relation to the concept of redemption. I've been thinking a great deal about what can be characterized as secular beliefs. So he refers to Kavanagh's the uses of idolatry, the book, but of course also early work by persons like Martin Marty, so the Fundamentalism Project, Bella, Max Weber. Do you think that there is some possibility for developing the notion of secular belief in relation to radical redemption that is not primarily attached to a religious tradition?
Yes, I think I'm already doing that in using, I'm a political historian. So for political historian, political ideologies could also be understood as secularized religions, if you like. And if you look at the anarchist creed, if you look at nationalist creeds, if you look at what the RAF vouched for and struggled for, the Red Army factions and the revolutionary terrorists, it all has this eschatological timeline. Bad past, going to break away with the future by revolution or upending or the great replacement theory. And then in the end, there will be a better, a more purified, a more harmonious world. So it's eschatological. Also, the way to get there, for example, the Red Army faction almost had 10 commandments. They borrowed them from socialism, had the 10 geboten für den socialistische Menschen, the 10 commandments to become a socialist person. So they appropriated religious symbols. And the nationalists, well, I just showed you these pictures. They also use martyr-like things, saint-like figures, rosaries, symbols, the earning points. You have to earn your way into the kingdom of God, whereas you're Muslim or Christian or even secularized. So I think political ideology approach can be used as a form of secularized religion, and it's very hard to make a distinction between it. Sometimes people just say, yeah, well, if you don't believe in God, you're not religious. But what if you believe in the Endkampf, or what if you believe in the Supermensch, or the Übermensch? What if you believe in the end of the class struggle? These are all very transcendental, higher-end belief systems. I don't know if that's what you were looking for in an answer, but as a political historian, I would answer it that way, I think.
Yeah.
But perhaps Richard can say something about how he analyzes and operationalizes religion and nationalism in the Irish struggle, because as you said, it's very much intertwined there.
Yeah, I think the intertwining is the key thing. It's very hard mechanically to separate them, and I think attempts to do that fail. One of the great things about your book, Beatrice, is it doesn't attempt mechanically to pull them apart, and it respects the interweaving of them. And there's much in nationalism which has a kind of quasi-religious quality to it, but there's much in religion which is political. I think that comes out really, really strongly in this new book.
All right. Well, there's no need to anything to add anything to that. Thank you so much, in particular, Beatrice, for answering all the questions that we had, and Richard for providing that insightful comment. It was a pleasure to have you all. Yeah. Congratulations again on the book. The recording will soon be online on the website and on YouTube. We've recorded the whole thing, but we'll cut it and just put the first half online. So don't need to worry. You don't need to worry that your questions will be online as well. So the next book in the series, the volume on the conceptual foundations of the study of extreme belief and behavior, edited by John Horgan and me, will be out sometime this summer. So I think sometime in September or October, we will have a digital book launch for that book. So hope to see all of you back there. And let me end by wishing you all a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Rick, for making this all possible.
Sure,
And
my
Rich,
pleasure.
of course. Bye.
Bye-bye.